Hello everyone, my name is Simon Wickham. I'm the Senior Chaplain at the University of Gloucestershire, and I'd like to begin by saying a very warm welcome to this year's Michael Perham University and Cathedral Lecture. This is the 6th in a series of lectures offered in partnership by Gloucester Cathedral and by the University. They are named in honour of Michael Perham, the former Bishop of Gloucester. Michael was a Pro-Chancellor of the University and served as the Chair of the University Council. And he did a great deal to strengthen the links between the University, the Cathedral and the Diocese. Usually these lectures alternate between taking place in the Cathedral and in the University Chapel here near where I am. This year will be our first online lecture. Although we will miss very much the chance to be together in one place, this does allow people to join from further afield. So I know we have people today joining from the United States, from India, and from all around the UK. So welcome to you all. And we're delighted to be welcoming the Revd Professor David Wilkinson to speak to us today. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Bishop Rachel to introduce David, but first a couple of explanations. This event is in the form of a webinar, so you won't be able to be seen or heard. However, if you do have a question for David, you are welcome to type it into the Q&A at any point. The Q&A option on the computer is at the bottom of the screen, and on an iPad it may be at the top. David expects to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes or so for questions. And I will try and select a representative group of questions, although we may only have time for a few. We aim to finish by around 6:45. This lecture will be recorded and will be available to view on the University YouTube channel from next week if you want to share it with anyone. So now I'm going to hand over to Bishop Rachel to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Simon. My name is Rachel Treweek. I'm the Bishop of Gloucester, and I have the great privilege of being Michael Perham's successor. So I'm delighted to add my own words of welcome. It's disappointing in many ways that we're not able to meet in person, but it does mean, as Simon's just said, that many more people are being able to gather over Zoom. So let's be thankful for the science that's enabled that. I am indeed delighted this evening to welcome Revd Professor David Wilkinson to give this Michael Perham lecture. Some of you may already have heard David today as he presented Thought for the Day on Radio 4 this morning. He's a regular contributor. But that's not the key headline in who he is. It does give you a good glimpse into someone who wonderfully brings together the spheres of theology and science, not only in what he does, but in who he is. David is currently Principal of St John's College and Professor in the Department of Theology and Religion at Durham University. He has PhDs in both astrophysics and systematic theology. For many years, he's taken a keen interest in the interplay between science and religion. Once upon a time, he also actually served as a university chaplain in Liverpool, because David is not only trained as a scientist, but also as a Methodist minister. Unsurprisingly, he's written a number of books. They include God, Stephen Hawking and the Multiverse, and also a book entitled When I Pray, What Does God Do? I was fascinated to discover that David is interested in the relationship of theology to contemporary culture, and he's even written on the spirituality of Star Wars. That's not what we've asked him to speak about this evening. We have asked David to give a lecture under the title God and the Pandemic. And on this day, when we mark this next significant point of the roadmap out of this season of pandemic. It seems a very fitting day for someone who is both a scientist and a theologian to help us reflect on what we've been learning. What have we learnt about being led by the science? What have we been learning about the vulnerability of humans to the natural world? And where is God in all this? David, there's much more I could say to commend you, but without more ado, we look forward to what you have to say. But before you speak to us, I'm going to invite the very Reverend Stephen Lake, the Dean of Gloucester, to pray for us.
Thank you, Bishop, and welcome everybody. This is an important day, and I'd like to pretend that the University and the Cathedral planned this entirely around what I'm about to say, but that would give us too much credit, bearing in mind David's title of God and the pandemic. Today in this diocese, we remember Edward Jenner, who is known as the father of vaccination, who was the son of a priest in this diocese and ended up with a medical practice covering 400 square miles across the diocese, and of course was the pioneer of the smallpox vaccination. And there's a great big statue of him in the cathedral as you walk in. Double planning, as you can tell from my sticker, today I've had my second vaccination. So all of these things are happily coming together. And I shall use the prayer set for this day for Edward Jenner, which would have been written by Bishop Michael Perham. God of all truth, you gave to your servant Edward Jenner patience and wisdom to discover new ways to bring healing and hope to your world. Give us the same determination and integrity to serve your people after the example of our Saviour Jesus Christ, who is alive and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen.
Well, thank you very much. And may I thank you, Bishop, and the Dean and Chapter of the Cathedral and Vice-Chancellor for this invitation to give this lecture. It's an honour to do so, in part marking my own gratitude to Bishop Michael's leadership and thinking, and also this very important relationship, partnership between the university and the church, the academy and the church, which I think is extremely important. And thank you for arranging this and for allowing me to be part of it. You've given me the title, God and the Pandemic. And what can one say about such a massive subject? Where I want to start is with a podcast that I listen to when I go around my normal walk during the day. It's not terribly worthy in lots of ways, but it is very funny. And it's a podcast called Fortunately with Fee and Jane. They talk about lots of different things, and hearing a conversation with the Australian songwriter and comedian Tim Minchin, Jane Garvey, distinguished and experienced broadcaster, talks about how she's not a person of faith. Let me play just a short clip to you now.
I'm not a person of faith either, of any faith, and I would imagine this year has presented quite a challenge to people of faith. We're not really hearing a lot about that. Maybe I'm just moving in the wrong circles.
Can I ask you something though, Jane? If you had heard more from religious leaders of any faith, and somebody, what would they have been able to say that would have made you sit up and take notice if you're not a person of faith anyway?
You raise a good point. Yes, why would I be interested? But I'm conscious that to my mind, they've been peculiarly absent. And by the way, that's not to say that there aren't people of faith going round and about doing wonderful works to help the very vulnerable. I'm sure they all are.
It's hard to get column inches when you're sort of saying, why don't we just be kind to each other, or, you know.
Well, no, I suppose what I'm after is an explanation. Why has God let this happen?
It's a plague.
Yeah,
I mean,
is it?
there are radicals who think it's part of the end times, but the most gentle English religious people don't really have that much of a literal. They don't explain cars by God, or God just sits as a nice hymn in the background of their lives, which I completely respect and understand.
Does God sit as a nice hymn in the background to our lives in the midst of these difficult questions? Well, it's interesting, that point about whether the church has said that much about the pandemic. Recently, here as part of our work in a project called Equipping Christian Leaders in an Age of Science, we held a conference for senior church leaders on viral science and public theology. Hilary Benn MP was one of our guests, and he talked about how thrilled and thankful he was for the contribution of religious communities in the social fabric, caring and search for justice within regions and localities. And a lot of our work goes on in the background. But a senior producer of news events challenged us and said he wondered why he hadn't heard more of a narrative from Christians and church leaders. And he said some words that stayed with me. In a time of grief and compassion and hope, I would have expected a little bit more. Well, of course, there has been quite a lot said and written by church leaders and indeed other faith communities. There's a whole selection of books on God and the pandemic and numerous podcasts. But I wonder whether the move to virtual church for many of us has not just given us accessibility in some ways, but also taken us out of the public square in others. I think as we move forward, what I'm going to talk about tonight is some of the work that we've been doing in this project called Equipping Christian Leaders in an Age of Science, in understanding what's been going on in terms of God, science, and the pandemic. It's a project between Durham University and York University and the Church of England. But this is also a personal statement of mine in terms of living through this pandemic, just as we all have. And I'm afraid that the obvious but disappointing answer is I don't have easy answers to this tonight. I think that there's something about how Christians need to just pause in saying too much. And actually, as Bishop Rachel said, there's much for us to listen and learn through this pandemic. What can we listen and learn? And I've got a number of things to reflect upon this evening. Things that are, I think, for me, both challenging and helpful, and I hope will cause you to think and cause some discussion as we go on. So let me offer you a number of points, if I may. The first is this, and that is that there's something about recognizing the moment. I wish it need not have happened in my time, said Frodo. So do I, said Gandalf. And so do all who live to see such times. But that's not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given us. Those words from Tolkien have stayed with me during what I thought was going to be a short time, but has become a long time and quite a difficult time. Now, there are some Christians and some theologians who've romanticized the moment, romanticized the time. This is a time for the church to change. This is a time when everything is going to be different. I think we've got to be careful about romanticizing the moment. In 1988, Whitney Houston sang a song for the US American Olympic team, One Moment in Time, when I'm racing with destiny. The only trouble was, if you remember the 88 Olympics, that was when Ben Johnson raced with drugs in his bloodstream. And when the opening ceremony got it wrong by lighting the Olympic flame at the same time as letting go doves. I won't go into what happened, but it wasn't pretty at the time. I think we've got to simply recognize that this is difficult and tough and has been extended. At this point, Christians normally talk about different kinds of time. Chronos, which means a period of time, and kairos. Kairos is a way that the Bible talks about time as a proper or opportune time for action. The appointed time in the purpose of God is often how it's talked about. Or as the Wesleyan theologian Donald English talked about, there are moments which God feels with great meaning. And these moments of meaning are not easy answers or easy journeys. When Jesus talks about the time is fulfilled, it's going to lead a journey to the cross. But I do think that this is a moment where we can ask the question, what does the kingdom look like in this moment? And also, it's a moment to mark. Next week is the 80th birthday of Bob Dylan. The times are a-changing, but as the times change, I think there are very important things for us to say. How do we mark significant moments in our national life? Whether it be in the visual or whether it be in liturgy. It's interesting that the Spanish flu at the early part of the 20th century was largely ignored as people simply wanted to move on from it. What does it mean to remember this moment, it seems to me? The second thing to offer you is something I think about, a place for lament. Lament is a place, I think, yes, for mourning and grieving, and we've experienced that in the pandemic, when behind the numbers are personal stories. But the time or place of lament is also a place for longing. When U2 reflected on Sunday, Bloody Sunday in the album War, they reflected biblical language, particularly from the Psalms, asking the question, how long, Lord, must we sing this song? And within a time of lament, I think there's a place for anger and reassessing priorities. We've seen that in the climate crisis, in Black Lives Matter, in the outpouring following the death of Sarah Everard. There are moments in lament where we need to attune ourselves to the voice of God and say, what is God saying during this time of lament? There's also, I think, a place for patience and a place for uncertainty. And we've seen that not just with the opening up today, but also what the roadmap might mean in the days to come. And so my question here in terms of a place of lament is something about what are we learning? Not simply to go back to the world as it was, but as we've learned in exile or wanderings, what does it mean to go back somewhere different and new? Those are the two ways of introduction, in a sense. Now let me move on to the science and some of the questions that come out of that. And the third thing I want to offer is that I think this is a time to resist unhelpful narratives. Theology often tells you what not to think rather than what to think. It cautions you against oversimplistic ways of describing God's activity in the world or the world itself. And what we've done, and I'm going to refer to the work of my colleagues here largely and give credit to them, is we've begun to uncover some unhelpful narratives in terms of whether they are good descriptions of what God is doing. The Pew Research Center in July 2020 interviewed a number of US adults and found that 86% of US adults think the pandemic provides lessons for humanity, and 35% said it was a lesson sent by God. And we'll probably remember those far-off days when President Trump described his illness as a blessing from God. I think there are narratives here that I want to resist. And my colleague, Dr. Toko Kamwendo, who works with me in Durham, has highlighted this in interviewing 12 bishops during the pandemic. And what she's found is some really interesting data. I'm going to pick out one theme from it out of many. And that is what she's discovered, is that the most consistently mentioned unhelpful narrative that bishops identified hinged on an understanding of the pandemic as an act of God. That God sent this for punishment. Now, we might expect that. But let's just drill down a little bit and ask why that might be the case. Well, the first is, I think there's an obvious thing to say that theological training, out of which most of us have come, has resisted interventionist theologies, a capricious God who does some things but not others, and the difficulty of that in understanding a God of love. But also the fraught history of Christian commentators interpreting natural disasters as divine action. Whether it be the Lisbon earthquake, which we might come back to if we've got time, right at the end, or in natural disasters in New Orleans or Haiti. But Toko goes on to say that actually something much deeper is going on. That by resisting this punishment narrative, it maintains a space for the pandemic, the suffering, and the virus that caused it to be understood as part of creation. And also that by maintaining a focus on human agency and responsibility as the most appropriate response to the pandemic. So resistance to the punishment narrative is important because the punishment narrative leaves crucial questions such as punishment for who and for what sin, and is best understood as a way of rendering what is a blunt ethical instrument less viable. So the bishops recognize that that's an unhelpful narrative for these reasons. There's another unhelpful narrative going around in the pandemic. And this comes out of the work of another of my colleagues at York University, Dr. Franziska Colt. And she identified very early in the pandemic that one of the narratives that was being used not just by politicians, but by some church leaders was a battle or conflict we were having with an evil virus. That actually this was a conflict model of ourselves with the virus. The government have used this quite a lot, or the Prime Minister particularly has used this quite a lot. There was a moment just before the autumn lockdown when the Prime Minister talked about humility before nature. But very quickly, once the vaccination program was discovered to be possible and could be rolled out, then it became back into this metaphor, this picture of a powerful jab, a way that we could subdue the virus into submission. Now, the problem of using a conflict model like this is it leads to lots of different consequences. One of the consequences is if you talk about conflict, you rally the troops, you rally communities in a common purpose. That's being used in lots of different ways, in lots of different places, at lots of different times. But the danger is that you paint a picture of conflict with that which is to be feared. And it allows you also to describe certain people as heroes within the conflict, even if you're pushing them out of the trenches into inadequate situations. And a book published today by Laura Dodsworth called A State of Fear talks about how fear has been leveraged by certain people with power within our society in order to try and control people's behavior. I think this is a dangerous part of how we've dealt with the pandemic. And not least, of course, because it sets up a conflict between human beings and the rest of creation, the created order. And this sense of human beings being apart from, different in mastery over the created order, as many of you will know, led to, in part, the environmental crisis. In 1967, the historian Lynn White at the American Association for the Advancement of Science said that our environmental crisis was in part because of the deep-rooted assumption that we are superior to nature, contemptuous of it, willing to use it for our slightest whim. Our present science and our present technology are so tinctured with the Orthodox Christian arrogance towards nature that no solution for our ecological crisis can be expected from them alone. Now, White actually went on, it's not often reported, but he did go on. And he argued that since the roots of our trouble are so largely religious, the remedy must be essentially religious, whether we call it that or not. He called for a refocused Christianity, not a wholesale repudiation of it. That is, what we do about ecology depends on ideas of the human-nature relationship. As we look at the virus, how we describe it, how we describe creation, is dependent on deep-rooted theological assumptions of how we are part of creation. And I was delighted, Dean, that you started with Edward Jenner, because that's where I'm going to come now. And Jenner was an amazing person who both brought healing, but also delighted in creation and nature. He wrote, "While the vaccine discovery was progressive, the joy I felt at the prospect before me of being the instrument destined to take away from the world one of its greatest calamities was often so excessive that in pursuing my favorite subject among the meadows, I've sometimes found myself in a kind of reverie. It's pleasant for me to recollect that these reflections always ended in devout acknowledgement to that being from whom this and all other mercies flow." His delight in creation, his knowledge of the Creator, and his sense that this was about a healing ministry rather than a conflict with nature was very important. And I also love that little verse that Mark puts into the prologue to his gospel in Mark 1. When Jesus is sent out into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness for 40 days, being tempted by Satan, the most pressurized of times. And Mark just includes this little phrase, he was with the wild animals. I find myself really taken with why Mark put that in. I think there's something there about how Jesus, in the midst of pressure, in the midst of a very, very difficult situation, sees that he's still part of the Father's creation. So there's something here about humility in creation. Let me move on in terms of resisting unhelpful narratives to my fourth point. And that is science-engaged theology within this difficult time that we've had. And in the early times of the pandemic, politicians used the mantra, we are going to be led by the science. Trouble is that it wasn't as easy as that. And we've seen that. Science is provisional. Some of the things we now know about the transmission of the virus have evolved to what it was in the early days. We've seen that in the practice that we've had to adopt. There's a range of scientific disciplines. They don't always speak with the same voice. Epidemiologists will say one thing, psychologists might want to say another thing. Science is not a monolith. It is a variety of complex voices with a degree of provisionality. And perhaps most importantly, science is done by scientists. Now, you might be very disappointed that you've gone to all of the effort to come onto this lecture this evening to hear someone say, science is done by scientists. But it's really important that science is a personal and a social activity. Chris Whitty needs to have someone to do his next slides for him. He can't do it just by himself, it seems. Professor Ottoline Lisa, the Chief Executive Office of UK Research and Innovation, talks about, and has talked about particularly during this pandemic, the need to make science a visible process. And we've seen that played out in the press conferences in front of us in the last 12 months. Sir Patrick Vallance, in talking to Parliament's Health and Social Care Committee in April 2020, said this: decisions are informed by science. They're not led by science. And I think that's important as we think about how science engages with theology. There is a danger, I think, for theologians, obviously, to reject science. There is, amongst those who've rejected science, amongst conspiracy theorists, a real neglect of public health, I think. And if theology says that God is creator of this physical world in which we live, move, and have our being, then we need to take what God has done seriously. And when Kepler talked about science is thinking God's thoughts after him, there is this sense of delight in the scientific task for theologians. But I think there's a danger of being led by the science in a way that it dominates theology. I think we saw that with the adoption of the clockwork universe, the mechanistic universe of dear Sir Isaac Newton. The beauty of creation epitomized in the simplicity of the Newtonian laws, which talked about the planetary motions, meant that you could buy an orrery like this, a little toy, which gave you the impression that the universe is clockwork, it's predictable. You can predict what it was like in the past, you can predict what it's like in the future. The world is picturable, understandable, and predictable. And that was lovely for some people who wanted to use the argument for design to prove God. The trouble is that the world's not like that. And in the 20th century, we began to see something called quantum mechanics and something called chaos theory and complex systems. Don't worry, I won't go into it this evening. We might want to go into the questions. But the world is far more interesting, far more subtle, far more open than that clockwork universe. The trouble was that many theologians got stuck in the clockwork universe. How can God intervene by poking his finger into a clockwork mechanism? Actually, the world is much more dynamic, much more relational than that. And then I think there's the danger of seeing science as savior. That thing that Richard Borkham and Trevor Hart a number of years ago talked about as the myth of human progress, that one day science will deliver us with technology and education to a utopia. And the trouble is that science has wonderful gifts and expertise to bring about healing through the vaccination program. But it doesn't save us from everything. And therefore, I think science-engaged theology sees science and theology in a dialogue, which is open, provisional, and personal. This is not just about the monolith of theologians of theology talking to the monolith of science. This is about scientists and theologians, physicists and church leaders, epidemiologists and pastors, sitting down together and talking about the nature of science and theology. And in some of the conferences that we've been privileged to host, the most important thing has not been the set piece lectures. It's been the way over coffee or in the bar at night, senior church leaders and scientists have sat down and talked together with seriousness and fun. And I think it also is a reminder to me of what the late John Polkinghorne, who just died just a few weeks ago, would talk about a bottom-up approach to the dialogue of science and theology. What he meant by that was, let's take for instances, specifics, not talk about how theology and science necessarily relate to each other in a philosophical meta-narrative sense. But as we look at viruses, what does that mean for understanding God? When we look at the existence of life, perhaps on other planets, what does that mean for our thinking about God? So science engaged theology. I hope this is all right and you're still with me. Don't worry, there's not too much more to go. The fifth point I'd like to bring you, and that is something about the importance in all of this of death and resurrection. Ian McKillop's amazing picture, as I was doing my research on the lecture this evening, I was taken with this picture. At the heart of the Christian faith is this sense of death and resurrection. In the midst of fear and death, there is something very profound for Christians to cling to celebrate in the right sense, to put at the center, which is about the death and resurrection of Jesus. Bishop Mike Beasley, who has spoken often during this pandemic, has often remarked upon the avoidance of us talking about death, as if we see it as a complete failure. Christians have much more to say about death. Right at the heart of the Christian faith is a God who in Jesus dies on a cross. A God who stands with us in the mess, in the pain, in the grief. And in the resurrection of Jesus, the bodily resurrection of Jesus, there's a sense that this world is not the end of God's purposes, that there is a new creation, a new heavens, a new earth coming, of which the resurrection is both the evidence and the example of that which is to come, providing the hope for us. Now, at that level, death and resurrection operates as a way to frame Christian life. But I think there's also a sense in which we see death and resurrection in the world around us. In John chapter 12, when a group of Greeks come to see Jesus, John says this, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly, I tell you the truth. Unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it produces many seeds. Anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life." Death and resurrection is written into creation in lots of different ways. As an astrophysicist, the birth of the universe, particularly the elements of carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen that make up my body, come from a generation of stars that have died. There is new life given through that death. Within the biological world, death and resurrection is going on. And I think what John may be touching on here is to say that which is in Jesus, that you see in Jesus, is a reflection not just of the redemptive work of Jesus, but a reflection of the very nature of creation itself. Let me quote Donald English again. "The principle of death and resurrection will operate anywhere, any way, but its supreme example in the death and resurrection of Christ demonstrates how the process should work." Let me move on. And that's to the sixth point to offer you. And that's something about learning a little more about science as a vocation in all of this. During the Big Bang Theory, by which I mean the comedy series rather than the actual birth of the universe, astrophysicists became cool. And I was quite pleased about that because really I was a nerd and still am a nerd. I have to now say that it's the epidemiologists who are the cool scientists around the place rather than the astrophysicists. But I think the pandemic has allowed us to reinvest in seeing science as a vocation and to affirm it. We give thanks for the work of medical scientists and those working in the health professions. But this sense of science as a gift from God, the work of a scientist to be a vocation from God, is something that as a church we've not often really pushed. In 1867, the Lancet published a paper by Joseph Lister, the first of a series of articles on his use of antiseptic. Lister was an interesting scientist. Raised as a Quaker, he became a Scottish Episcopalian when he married Agnes. And at a graduation address at Edinburgh University in 1876, he told doctors, "If we had nothing but pecuniary rewards and worldly honours to look to, our profession would not be one to be desired. But in its practice, you will find it to be attended with peculiar privileges, second to none in intense interest and pure pleasures. It is our proud office to tend the fleshly tabernacle of the immortal spirit, and our path rightly followed will be guided by unfettered truth and love unfeigned. In the pursuit of this noble and holy calling, I wish you all Godspeed." I want to say Godspeed to all of my scientific colleagues and all of the professionals within the health services who have worked using science, exploring science. And for those who are Christians, who see their science as a vocation, I want to affirm that. I think I've often been to churches where young people who say, "Oh, I think God's calling me to be a missionary or a pastor or go to Bible college." The church will say, "Hallelujah." Bring the young person to the front, lay hands on them, pray for them, and probably give them a big check to help them with their fees during the time. But I wonder if a young person says, "I feel God's calling me to be a chemist, a biochemist, a sociologist, a physicist," whether churches would say the same thing. Say, "Hallelujah," bring them to the front, lay hands on them, and give them a check to help them with their fees in all of that. Reaffirming science's vocation seems to me to be important. And that leads me to come back to Bishop Michael and the final point, which is about what does this mean for liturgy? In the introduction to the new handbook of pastoral liturgy, he writes, "What will stop the descent from sparkle that has about it a hint of heaven to superficiality is engagement with the cross and its outworking in the lives of those who suffer. The church's worship is never an escape from the world." Seems to me that liturgy has an important part to play in all of this. Recognizing moments, giving space for lament, resisting false narratives, giving a place for science in worship and preaching, in drawing us back to death and resurrection, and praying for vocation, whether it be in the church or in the university, whether it be in the school or in the hospital, whether it be in the home or whether it be in the business. Because liturgy allows us to see things in different ways. 2 summers ago, I was in the States as part of the 50th anniversary celebrating the Apollo 11 moon landing. And I shared a lecture with an amazing person called Paul Lembo. Paul Lembo was, I think, about 21 when NASA asked him to build the lunar lander, the thing that took Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong onto the surface of the moon. He had a whole team of engineers under him, and his job was to build not just Apollo 11, but a whole number of lunar landers. And he told this story. He said that in order to get the seals right with the very thin metal that was part of the lander. And to get the rivets flat, they couldn't find any machines to tell them that they were flat. Now, if you imagine that these were very sensitive things, you don't want them being sheared and all the rest of it. And NASA recruited a team of people who were blind. And their job was to run their fingers across the rivets and across the joints, because their sense of touch was far more sensitive than the machines that were around. Sometimes you can see things in different ways. You can see things differently. And for me, the church's worship, the reading of the scriptures, the saying of prayers, allows me not easy answers when it comes to the pandemic, but it allows me to see things in slightly different ways. I said I might come back to the Lisbon earthquake. So let me come back to the Lisbon earthquake, if I may, to finish. On the 1st of November, 1755, on All Saints' Day, an earthquake hit, which led to a tsunami and a fire in the city of Lisbon. Estimates vary between 6% to 30% of the population were killed by what happened. It was a devout Roman Catholic city, and one of the remarkable things about this was that most of the city's 40 churches and 90 convents were destroyed, with many people that worship within them. And yet, many of the city's brothels weren't. This led, as you might imagine, to intense theological scrutiny. But in fact, it wasn't just questions about brothels or convents. It was much deeper than that. The scale of the disaster in Lisbon was matched by the profundity of its effects on 18th century thought. In the philosophy, literature, and science, existing models of the relationship between human beings and the natural world and the divine were brought into question. Immanuel Kant laid some of the foundations for seismology. In theology, some pointed the finger. We're very good at that, particularly within the Christian church, pointing blame. Some Roman Catholics pointed the blame at Lisbon, saying it wasn't Roman Catholic enough. Some Protestants pointed the finger of blame and said it's because it's Roman Catholics. But there were deeper theological questions. For Voltaire, this was a reminder that this is not the best of all possible worlds. We live in a capricious and at times cruel world, was his interpretation. Rousseau found it as a condemnation of cities, arguing that this wouldn't have happened if we were all living in a more natural way. The fundamental question was God absent or was God cruel in the midst of this? Now, I am a Methodist minister, and therefore I'm under contract to mention the name of John Wesley at every public lecture that I ever do. So let me do that. And actually, on this occasion, it's relevant, would you believe it? Because the Wesleys were particularly interested in earthquakes. Charles Wesley had experienced a number of earthquakes in and around London, and actually wrote a number of hymns on the subject of earthquakes, published in 1750. The Wesleys saw this as an opportunity for being woken up, was the image. That actually there was something about a natural disaster that called for repentance. I have to say that John Wesley wasn't terribly good at this. He was a pointer of the finger in the early days, particularly at the Inquisition at Lisbon. But later on, in his serious thoughts occasioned by the late earthquake at Lisbon, he talked a little more, and he struggled with a fundamental question, which is, if we say God is absent, then what does that mean about God in relationship with creation? If we say God is directing earthquakes? Does this mean that God is cruel? And he struggled with it to the point of saying, nature is the art of God. It is God acting upon the created world. But seeing nature not just as an end in itself, but also as you needed to see it in the light of new creation, that God's purposes weren't finished with this creation. Now, Wesley didn't give any answers, and neither am I tonight. I think his serious thoughts led in part to what Wendell Berry calls the wisdom of humility. But sometimes we simply say, we don't know. We don't have easy answers. So going back to Fee and Jane, I don't think that church leaders can give easy answers for why this is happening. But we can engage in dialogue. We can listen and we can learn. We can find out more about science and the nature of science through all of this. And there are resources that we can offer into the conversation, which will be open-ended and messy and go slightly over the time that I've been allotted. But please forgive me for that. Thank you very much.
Simon, we're now on you.
So thank you very much, David. At this point, there would normally be an initial round of applause to give David, I think, a chance to just have a drink and take a breath as we all do the same and as we digest his wonderful lecture and all that he has opened up to us. And so we've already got some questions coming in, and I'm going to try and just group those a little bit and pick out 1 or 2 themes, so that David can continue that opening up that he's been doing for us. So there are 3 questions here about science, which I just want to group together. How much has the rejection of science by theology and theology by science led to a move away from the creationist explanation of the pandemic to the punishment narrative, which we heard about in certain spheres of Christian faith? And importantly, how do we construct a narrative to realign the balance? So that's a question about science and theology.
Thank you.
And with that, maybe a couple more. In the press today, there's a suggestion that universities should abandon courses in humanities and concentrate purely on sciences. How does that fit in with it? And then one last one, which might tie in. There are numerous eminent scientists who do not agree with the current handling of the pandemic. They are silenced as false narrative that seem to come from a place of love and sincerity. What does God think of them? On whose side is God on? So I don't know if those are 3 that you could begin with, David.
Yes, thank you, Simon. So I think when it comes to the relationship between science and theology, we simply have to own the history that we have inherited, and we've got to be real about that. So although conflict between science and theology is not, in terms of history, the most dominant form of relationship between the two, it's certainly the one that's been propounded within the media and popular culture. And I think we've got to understand that that's where a lot of scars have been left. And we need to go beyond that simple model of conflict to say there have been other ways of relating science and faith. And actually that the perceived conflict is actually far more interesting and far more fruitful. So when Galileo or Darwin are trotted out as this is a rejection of Genesis 1 or this is a rejection of theology, I think there's a task for the church to say, no, actually it isn't. And the academic scholarship is there to do it. I think it's about translating it into the public square and within popular conversation to say that part of the reason that Galileo pointed his telescope at the universe in the first place was he believed that God was free to create, and therefore he wanted to look at what God wanted to put in creation. So there's something, I think, about recognizing where we are and then working a little more at what the true history is and showing that that's a little more interesting. But certainly there are deep scars there, both within science, which has, in some of the post-Darwinian controversies, felt rejected and unheard by churches, but also, I think, within particular groups of people where science has been abused. And here I'm thinking of a number of Black majority churches, which we've been working with, who remember the history of the way that Black people have been discriminated against and indeed experimented upon within science. Now, healing, I think, has to take these things seriously and has to address it and give space to talk about it, to offer apology, to listen to the experience of people who've been deeply hurt by that. And the narratives that I think that come out of that, which are healing narratives, you'll find in particularly the work of my colleague and good friend Tom McLeish, who talks about the importance of science as a reconciler and theology as a reconciler. That reconciliation, the ability to take on board different views, to sit in the same room and talk about them, to strive for reconciliation should be part of this discussion. So how do we get back to a balance? I think it's about rediscovering that sense at the heart of Christian faith is that reconciling ministry that Paul will talk about in Colossians 1, for example, as he describes Jesus. Now, the question then moves on, I think, which is, should humanities have a place alongside science within a university? And for me, yes, it should, although I'm conscious that I'm privileged in a university like Durham to have that opportunity. There are some hard economic choices having to be made by universities at the moment. Those are not easy and are quite complex. But I think what we see is that people learn science well when it's taught with some history and philosophy alongside it. We know of this from the way that children learn science. Many will reject science at an early stage if they don't have some of the history and the philosophy that goes along with it. Humanities and science have an amazing ability, if allowed and given the space, to enrich each other. And therefore, I think one can't say that every student who does a physics degree should do some humanities. The rate of the way the individual subjects are going means that you can't insist on that. But to have the opportunity within schools and universities for cross-curricular discussion, for cross-curricular learning, for different people from different subject areas to simply talk together over lunch seems to me to be a really important thing. And the church perhaps has a way of helping that. And that's why I think a brilliant connection here between the diocese, the cathedral, the university is of such importance in this. And the third question, I'm trying to make notes quickly. And it was something, Simon, could you just help me, was about false narratives?
Yes, hang on a minute.
Forgive me, I got carried away and didn't make enough notes.
Yes, so thank you for this wonderful presentation. There are numerous eminent scientists who do not agree with the current handling of the pandemic.
Yes, sorry, thank you.
There's false narrative that seem to come from a place of love and sincerity. What does God think of them and whose side is God on? Yeah,
thank you. Within our own situation in Durham at St. John's College, we purposely did a couple of Café Scientifiques where we got different voices on the particular issue of herd immunity, which you'll know has been very much at the core of some of the disagreement between certain epidemiologists. And we got two people in different seminars to help our students think about their different views on herd immunity. And that was a very moving experience, it has to be said, because we heard the person describing why they thought this was the important scientific way forward and why they disagreed with another eminent scientist, and backwards and forwards. And I think we should hear voices. Now, again, there's a very practical issue here, and that is in allowing voices to be heard, how do we help people understand the weight of scientific opinion for particular positions? So the difficulty sometimes is if you think you want a good conversation, you pick two people from opposite ends of the spectrum who are going to disagree with each other. And we see this in terms of sometimes climate crisis, don't we? There's a climate denier and there's a climate scientist. And they're brought together for immediate discussion. But the reality is that most scientists believe that global warming is human produced. And so how do you give a sense of the weight of scientific opinion to the non-specialist to be able to understand that some voices might be quite lone voices? And if you push that into conspiracy theories, then there's something there where I think you have to help people understand how to critique science. And that's back to Dame Otterline's sense that science education is not just about what science gives us, it's also about how science works, how science asks the questions. So yeah, let me stop there on that one.
Thank you, David. Could I just ask a couple of questions about human behavior, really? So the first one is from my colleague, Alex Masado. Thank you, David, for such an illuminating lecture. I was interested in your take on fear not being helpful or a helpful narrative when leveraged to control people's behavior in relation to the pandemic. If we take climate change, we're just talking about, which puts the pandemic into some sort of perspective, given how late we are in recognizing the science around climate change, do we not need fear as an understandable reaction to the science and as part of the arsenal to help change people's behavior in addition to reason or indeed faith?
Yes.
So along with that, we're very pleased to have Alison Perham here, Michael's wife, and she asks a question: do you think that there is a role for awe as a lever for change in our post-pandemic society by its facilitation of curiosity and collaboration by both religious and scientific associations?
Yes. Can I deal with the second point first? And thank you, Alison, thank you. Yes, I do agree. And one of the interesting things that we're beginning to see, and particularly picking up on that word curiosity, is citizen science, allowing people to participate in the scientific process, to question it, to get involved in it, whether it be in Universe Zoo or Galaxy Zoo, which allows you to go online and classify galaxies and give you a sense that you're involved in this and experience some of the things that scientists experience about judgment, for example. But I think also that sense of the prophetic, that we are all called to be questioners. There's nothing wrong. I think virtually every scientist I know dreads one thing, and that is at the end of a lecture, there are no questions. Most scientists I know are delighted when a student sometimes quite tentatively puts up a hand and then demolishes the whole lecture that they've just given, because that's the way that we learn. And that sense of how do we open up, not just science, but how do we open up theology to questions? So, of course, my favorite disciple of the New Testament, and I know you have a wonderful stained glass window in the cathedral, is of course Thomas. He's not a doubter. He's a questioner. He's the one who asks the questions that the other disciples are too embarrassed to ask. He's the one who interrupts the meeting and the flow of the lecture in order to ask the question that eventually will lead to illumination in a very profound sense. So yes, absolutely. Now, in terms of fear and human behavior, I think that's a fair point. I think fear is part of the response. But fear by itself becomes a very blunt weapon. So the climate crisis, I think, the mistake is to divorce fear from beauty and hope. When Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, we were beginning to see just in the 1960s how what we were doing with the climate was leading to bad consequences. But a lot of the energy for the climate movement came from the Apollo photographs of the Earth, particularly Apollo 8's Earthrise. And that sense of the beauty of the Earth rather than fear. Now, how do you then put that with hope? Because fear by itself can lead to a turning in, a paralysis at times of we can't do anything about it. So what is it about hope? Now, for me, the Christian faith says, my hope for the climate crisis is not just about the ingenuity of scientists, the voices of young people, the way that we can change things. It's also, as a theologian would say, an eschatological hope. That is, I believe, that God is in the process of transforming creation into new creation. And that gives me courage, hope, that what we do in the everyday has longer term consequences. So fear, I think, by itself has dangers. And it has to be coupled with beauty and hope in order to lead to lasting change. Otherwise, it becomes a blunt instrument with just short-term change.
Great, thank you. Thank you, David. So just coming more to some maybe questions coming from a more purely theological angle here. I've got one from my predecessor here, Bruce Scott Goodwin, who was the chaplain here at the university before. Great lecture. One thing you haven't mentioned is the fall. How does that fit into your understanding of the pandemic? And there may be one or two others we could put with that. So one from Tudor Griffiths. Can we have more about the relationship of Jesus' death and resurrection to the pandemic as more than a general principle written into creation? And the first question we had, does the occurrence of this unprecedented pandemic have something to do with the shaking that God's word tells us of in the last days, the period of time before Jesus' return as king?
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for very easy questions this evening. I mean, these are really profound, and I'm not going to do justice to them. And I'm sorry that the technology, not being there in person, also means that there can't be then a dialogue backwards and forwards on one or two of these issues, which would actually be really helpful. The shaking image is interesting. There is a paper which argued that the Lisbon earthquake gave some grounds for language in philosophy about the shaking of foundations, shaky arguments and things of that sort. But I don't think in theology that I want to read this into the end times. I think partly because, lots of Christians over the years have predicted the end times when they haven't been here. And secondly, I think the apocalyptic images, particularly in the New Testament, are very difficult to interpret. They are there to inspire us and challenge us about a God who is working through creation to new creation. But I want to say that I don't want to be too specific about that. In terms of the fall, thank you, Bruce, for that question. And the nature of the fall within Christian theology is something that has worked through, not just in terms of human sin, our rebellion from God, but also something that describes the breaking of our relationship with one another and with creation itself. So the fall is not just about our breaking of relationship with God. It's also about our breaking of relationship of community and our breaking relationship with the creation. Christians then disagree, of course, on whether this is a description of how things are or whether it's a description of origins, of why we're in this position. Now, for what it's worth, and I'll make some friends on this and I'll make some enemies on this, I tend towards that sense that the fall is a description of where we are, rather than a space-time description of what actually was the origin of it. And it's interesting that within the scripture, the fall itself is not mentioned too often. The effects of the fall, our alienation from God, alienation from one another, alienation from creation, are there. Therefore, the new creation, inaugurated in the death and resurrection of Jesus, leading through to this new heaven and new earth, becomes a reconcile of relationship between ourselves and God, one another, and with creation itself. Now, Christians have often stressed the brokenness and then the healing of relationships of the individual with God and sometimes with one another. What we haven't been as good at is to tease out this breaking and healing of the relationship between human beings and creation. And that's where particularly the physical and biological universe becomes worth thinking about a little bit more. And I think that takes us back to Tudor's point, which really is one of those points that you'd want to sit down with a cup of coffee and just tease out over some hours. And that is the relationship that I was trying to get at, however inadequately, between creation and redemption. And the trouble often with science and theology as an academic discipline is that we've been very good to base it purely in reference to creation and the origin of creation. So there's been lots of science and theology on the Big Bang. I've written a bit myself on it, on biological evolution, on origins. What we've been less good at in terms of science and theology is to frame our discussion of science and theology with redemption and eschatology as participants in the discussion. Now, I think that's where some of the really interesting stuff in the next few years will come to theologically, is exactly the point that Tudor is making. How do we relate redemption and creation and new creation into this discussion? Simon, I'm afraid that's a way for me to avoid the question a little bit by saying it's a really good question and we need to talk more about it. But within the constraints that we've got this evening, I think that's the best I can do.
Obviously, leading on to us having ongoing conversations, which we need to have. If you're still happy to continue just for maybe 2 or 3 more questions.
Sure.
David, that would be lovely. There's a couple here on the economic effects of the pandemic.
Yeah.
So one from one of our associate chaplains, Suki, who says,
yes.
The inequality in wealth distribution across the world appears to have been made worse by the pandemic.
Yeah.
This clearly cannot be God's plan for his creation, or is it?
Yeah.
And then linked perhaps with that one, is not the challenge for Christians not to explain the pandemic, but to help to build back a world that is fairer, more just, more respectful, that values our key workers and immigrant health and care staff, and that realises that no one is safe until all are safe.
Yes, I think these are very well made points. And part of, I think if I'd had time to develop what the significance of the moment is, the kairos time, is to say, what are the priorities of the kingdom within this moment, within this time? And both of the questions there have picked up particularly that sense of inequality, of opportunity, which we've seen as the way that the virus has affected certain communities and not others, but also the opportunity for vaccination in terms of the economic system of which we're a part. Now, again, I want to be a realist in some of this and say that these are not easy questions for us. And balancing both the economic questions such as how much do big pharmaceutical companies need to get in order to do their research, with the way that politicians make decisions, which are not just, which are always in the light of their own electorate. These are questions for political and sociology and economic theorists to help us with. But I think the Christian prophetic voice would say these are kingdom priorities within the moment. That there is a way in which we see in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus of a self-giving for the other, which listens, is concerned about, and acts beyond any intellectual understanding of problems. And the problem of Christian theodicy, as it's sometimes called, of which the Lisbon earthquake gave a great deal of energy to, is trying to solve an intellectual issue with loving God, evil world, and often becoming deaf to the call of a loving God who says, go to this evil world. Go to this world that is suffering, I should have said, and do something about it. So Christian theologians have rightly, particularly in the 20th century, said that part of our response to God and the pandemic and God and other things is not simply to solve the intellectual question in a way that allows someone to give a really clear lecture in the way that I haven't been able to do tonight, but actually the Christian gospel is about standing up with rage and anger at times, but certainly for action in social justice and social caring that makes a difference to the world. And I think that for me is the kairos moment. Now, again, this is the importance of liturgy, of how we worship. If worship is not embedding within itself that sense of mission, of moving out into the world, then I don't think we are doing justice to the Christian gospel or to the way that we worship. And that sense that at the heart of death and resurrection is, this is the path to which I call you to follow, says Jesus. Take up your cross. It's not simply a spectacle to be watched. It's a story in which to participate.
Thank you. Maybe just two more questions. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
So the first one is from a former student here, Nolan, who is now a seminarian over in the US, who says, as a seminarian myself, how might we integrate the relationship between science and faith into theological education, which I guess might bring some enthusiasm from you, David.
Yeah.
And then the second one from our former New Testament professor here, Andrew Lincoln, who says, if the narrative of a conflict against COVID is unhelpful,
Yeah.
Is there a more helpful narrative that still accounts for and recognises that the virus is not benign, but has been damaging to human flourishing? So that quite small question there might be a good one to finish with.
Thank you, Andrew. And I'm partly, if I'd been in the room, I would have sent the question back to you for your comment on it. But I think for me, there's something in a narrative of fragility and vulnerability about the nature of creation and the nature of human beings. A sense of we live in a fragile world where there is vulnerability both within the natural creation and towards human beings. And I think that was what Edward Jenner was picking up as I've read some of his writings. It's certainly, if you come to the cholera epidemic later on in the 19th century in Charles Kingsley, and again, my colleague Dr. Colt, I mean, this was her PhD, so she knows everything about this in a way that I've just dipped my toe into the water of the water babies, is to say that there is a fragility of the natural world, particularly if humans don't make wise decisions on certain things. And that's not poking the blame at humans in the sense of singling out certain humans against others. But that narrative of mutual vulnerability, I think is important for me. And Nolan, thank you for the question. As a seminarian, two things I think excite me about this. The first is that in the US and now in the UK, under the banner of DOSA in the States and E-Class here in the UK, we both have programs called Science for Seminaries. And we're working here in the UK at the moment with 9 theological colleges and courses to help them to embed science within the curriculum. Now, this isn't to create a new course in science and religion that every ordinand or trainee church leader has to do. After all, they've got an awful lot of courses to do already. This is to say, when we teach ethics or we teach philosophy or we teach mission or apologetics, what does it mean to get scientific voices into the room? So I think there's a program for that, which is at the level of responsibility of the institution. But I think there's a more important thing, which is also at the level of the institution and the level of the student. And that is that we need to value the experience and expertise that every person brings into church leadership. Theological education isn't about a blank sheet of paper, which we then fill up with brand new theology. Theological education, I think, is taking the very detailed pattern of a person's life experience and expertise and weaving theology into that, highlighting where it already is. And this is particularly, I think, for the case of those scientists who move on to church leadership. It's about recognizing that the gifts that they bring with them are valuable to mission and ministry and to the life of the church as a whole, and giving them opportunity to specialize by developing the relationship of their own scientific discipline and their own theological passions, rather than trying to cover every little bit of theology or pastoral practice. We are a church together. So ministry and mission is about a church together, recognizing different gifts in each of us, working together. I better stop there or I'm going to go on all night.
Thank you so much, David, for addressing those questions. And I do apologise to those people whose questions have not been answered. But I hope you've had a chance, all of you, to read the questions and maybe something to ponder about. I'm going to hand over now to our Vice Chancellor, Stephen Marston, to give a vote of thanks.
Great. Thank you, Simon. Good evening, everybody. It's my great pleasure to be able to conclude this evening's proceedings with Thanks to all of those concerned. Firstly, to everybody who has joined this seminar this evening. Thank you. As Simon said at the outset, it's one of the benefits, perhaps one of the few benefits of the situation we're in, that we've been able to welcome a much larger number of people from a much larger number of places to join this event. So thank you, all of you, for joining in. Thank you for those who asked questions and made comments. Secondly, thank you to everybody who's organised this. Simon Whitcomb, our chaplain, Bishop Rachel, Dean Stephen, colleagues Lystra and John, who have organised the technology, the logistics, made the event happen. It doesn't happen by itself, even with the very best of technology. So thank you to all of you who have organised it. But of course, above all, thank you to David for a really stimulating, rich, rewarding lecture. It seems to me this has been a fabulous example of something that I feel we really, really need, which is the space to stand back, to reflect, and try to make some sense of what is happening to us. David used the phrase living in the moment. And in a not very comfortable way, it certainly felt like that now for well over a year. I will remember, I think for the rest of my life, probably the 23rd of March, 2020, when we had to turn the whole university on a sixpence and put everything online. Boy, have we been living in the moment. Every new government announcement and press release, every new stage of the roadmap, we've been tracking the data day by day. We have had to respond in the moment. It's been very urgent, it's been very real. And that has been necessary, it's been right. We have had to adapt to a very unpredictable and fast-moving situation. But it has meant, I feel, that our spaces to stand back, to reflect, to try to make sense of things have been few, far between, and precious. And I think what David has done for us this evening has been to create a really significant space to try to get some proportion, some meaning into the situation we're facing. Because again, to use one of David's phrases, has it been an unhelpful narrative that we've been focused so much on the short term, the pain it has caused, the suffering it has caused, the reality of what this has meant to people, with less space to reflect on? So what do we take from all of this? What do we learn from all of this? David's phrase about the need to balance fear with beauty and hope. I feel one thing that's been happening in our university dialogue and discourse is that in a rather counterintuitive and perhaps paradoxical way, what we have learned is both that we can change successfully, we can react very quickly, that the technology is fabulous, that it allows us to do things we never dreamt that we could do and do them very, very fast. It's also, I think, having the effect of reaffirming some of the longer term, dare I even say eternal, aspects of the good life. What makes us as a community? What do we value about human contact? What do we value about a sense of belonging and community? I hope through these spaces of reflection, we can bring that back into the discussion. It's far, far too early to say, what have we gained from this whole horrible experience? But through these spaces for reflection, I think we can begin that discussion about what do we now want to reaffirm, because it has abiding value for us as human beings in our relationship with creation and other human beings. So I'd just like to say a huge thank you to David. I think you've done something really valuable for all of us this evening in helping us into that space of trying to make sense of the situation we have faced with all of its fear and all of its disruption. Sadly, the technology doesn't mean that we can applaud. As Simon's already mentioned, one of its drawbacks is that we cannot express our appreciation in the normal way. But I have no doubt that, David, you can intuit the waves of appreciation that are coming at you through the internet. So thank you ever so much, David. That has been a hugely valuable, important and positive evening for all of us. So thank you, and I hope you all have a very good evening, and we will draw it to a halt there. Thank you all ever so much.